Hello, everyone, and thank you for welcoming me to the Humans in Space Summit 2022. I'd like to say a big thank you to the organisers for all of their hard work in putting together this conference and for having me to speak to you today. I'm very excited to present to you. Today, I'll be discussing respiratory physiology and what happens to this essential body system in space. To discuss this topic, first, I will give a brief overview of the normal function of respiratory physiology, particularly focusing on the areas that are affected when in space. I will then discuss the main factors that affect lung physiology in space and what effect they have. And I will then discuss how those factors are addressed by astronaut teams. Respiratory physiology essentially comes down to the two main functions of the lung, ventilation and perfusion. The lung's primary roles are to obtain air from the environment and expel waste products back to that environment, and also to provide oxygen to the bloodstream in order to oxygenate organs. They perform these roles as follows. Ventilation is regulated by carbon dioxide concentration in the body as measured by receptors in the brainstem. These receptors signal to the brain to move air into the body through inspiration, where it flows into the alveoli, small ducts in the lungs that can then pass air into the blood vessels nearby in a process called perfusion. Once air has perfused into the blood vessels, waste products can be exchanged from the blood vessels back into the alveoli to travel back out of the body through exhalation. This process of inhalation and exhalation uses the difference in pressure between the lungs and the environment to create a pressure gradient, along which air can slide in and out of the lungs. So whilst pressure evidently has a significant effect on lung function, gravity also plays a significant role. Airflow and blood flow in the lung is not evenly distributed, but rather is subject to gravitational forces. The lung has a low pressure perfusion system. As the lung operates under such low pressure and has large vertical extension from above the clavicle to the diaphragm, there is a pressure gradient that exists within the lung related to gravity. The pressure in the lowest part of the lung is highest, followed by the middle section, followed by the top. This uneven pressure causes uneven perfusion in the lungs. As the blood is mostly located in the lower zone of the lung, it logically follows that there is greater perfusion in this zone to correlate. The lung on Earth is also subject to mechanical forces. Due to gravity, the weight of the lung means that the bottom of the lung is the most compressed, like a spring coiled together at the bottom. This means that it is the most able to inflate, as it has the most capacity to expand. Now, we've discussed the function of the lung in the normal environment, but what happens to the lung in space? In space, there are three main issues the respiratory system encounters as a result of the change in environment: the microgravity environment, the presence of moon dust, and the issue of decompression sickness. First to examine is the effect of the absence of gravity on the lungs. While gravity on Earth is constantly trying to pull blood into the lower extremities of the body, when there is an absence of gravity or a microgravity environment, such as in space, thoracic blood volume increases as it is no longer being pulled away from these upper parts of the body. This results in greater perfusion across the lung and makes the lung more efficient. The lack of gravity also removes the influence of mechanical forces on the lung. As mentioned previously, on Earth, the presence of mechanical forces mean that the lung is most capable of expansion and therefore ventilation at the bottom of the lung, where it is most compressed. However, when this is removed, the lung is at a relatively equal level of compression across its height. This causes a redistribution of ventilation and perfusion within the lung to be more even, also increasing ventilation efficiency. Moon dust can also have a surprisingly significant effect on respiratory physiology. Whilst perhaps this isn't the first issue that comes to mind when thinking about the effect of space on the lungs, moon dust is a big issue for astronauts. And there are several reasons why moon dust is particularly dangerous to astronauts. Firstly, there is no erosion on the moon. This means that unlike the smooth and rounded dust particles we find on Earth, the moon's dust particles are angular and sharp, which risk damaging the lungs if inhaled. The absence of gravity also means that the way that dust is inhaled is slightly different. On Earth, dust is inhaled and gravity gets it to settle down or sediment in the large airways. The absence of gravity means that dust doesn't form sediment in the lungs as it does on Earth. Instead, although less dust gets deposited, it is able to move further into the lung. And this movement further into the periphery of the lungs means it is more difficult for these particles to be cleared out of the lungs through mechanisms such as mucociliary clearance and coughing, and therefore it is retained in the lungs for longer, giving extra potential for this dust to cause health effects. Now, when people think of decompression sickness, often scuba diving comes to mind. However, decompression sickness also poses an issue for astronauts in space. Decompression sickness occurs on Earth when divers move to areas of greater pressure, being underwater, and the body tissues absorb greater amounts of nitrogen than at sea level. A rapid reduction in this pressure, such as ascending from a dive rapidly, causes this nitrogen to come out of solution, forming bubbles in the blood and in the tissues, which can have disastrous health effects. In astronauts, though, decompression sickness occurs slightly differently, although the mechanism remains the same. Whilst taking spacewalks, astronauts' spacesuits are at a much lower pressure than the pressure in the space station. This is because the suit needs to be movable for the astronaut to complete their task, which wouldn't be possible if the spacesuit was at the same pressure. As such, astronauts are at risk of nitrogen coming out of their blood and tissues whilst they are on their spacewalk, and therefore experiencing subsequent decompression sickness. Now, these issues with respiratory physiology in space are well identified and a field of emerging and current research, and thus aeronautical teams do have considerations in place to address and prevent these issues in astronauts. Now, firstly, coming to the absence of gravity, when astronauts have adjusted to being in space, there are largely no adaptations that need to be used for lung function. The evening out of ventilation and perfusion across the lung when in space means that, in fact, lung function is more efficient. And studies have shown that even long-term space missions at zero or microgravity do not have lasting structural changes on the lung. As such, the lung is able to function quite normally in space without intervention. Moving to moon dust, whilst it is a large issue on the moon and can most definitely have poor consequences on astronaut lung health, at present, there isn't really a protocol in place that is able to prevent the inhalation of moon dust. There have been several ideas posited, most recently an idea to use cryogenic or very low temperature droplets to remove dust from spacesuits as they re-enter the space station, therefore preventing excess dust from entering the main area of the space station. However, this idea and others are still being researched. But decompression sickness is preempted in astronauts through a process called denitrogenation. Similarly to the way that scuba divers conduct a safety stop and ascend slowly when completing a dive to allow their body to readjust to the changing pressure, astronauts also complete a similar process called oxygen pre-breathe. Now, oxygen pre-breathe involves a period of time where the astronaut is moved to increasingly lower pressure environments for an overnight period, culminating in a period of breathing 100% oxygen. This process reduces the partial pressure of nitrogen in the blood and tissues to avoid this nitrogen from coming out of solution on the spacewalk instead. Precautions are also taken to prevent decompression sickness by training astronauts prior to their missions with time spent in neutral buoyancy conditions. For each hour planned in a spacewalk, an astronaut undergoes 7 hours of training in neutral buoyancy in their spacesuits in order to help them adjust to the feeling of microgravity and to become familiar with the activities expected of them on spacewalks. This preparation allows astronauts to become familiar with the changes in pressure and therefore allows their body to experience what that change in air partial pressure feels like that they will experience on that spacewalk, thereby helping their physiology adjust before the actual event. To summarize, there is no doubt that traveling to space involves an incredible amount of consideration and research, particularly regarding astronaut health and physiology, of which I've only scratched the surface of just one body system in my presentation today. I hope that my presentation has provided an insight into some of these considerations and the incredible work and research required to address these issues when taking astronauts to space. Thank you again for taking the time to listen to my presentation.